Donald Trump lives in his own reality and he lies casually, but he's very, very good at it. He used to teach me, Stephanie, as long as you keep repeating something, it doesn't matter what you say.
I'm Sharon Brett-Kelly. Today on The Detail, in the gobsmacking torrent of stories coming out of the Trump administration, two were very close to home.
Donald Trump's pick as health secretary has been grilled today over claims he worsened Samoa's 2019 measles outbreak that cost 83 lives, including many young children.
US Senator Ted Cruz accused New Zealand of punishing Israeli citizens, referring to news articles incorrectly claiming Israelis must disclose military service details as a condition of entry. Foreign Minister Winston Peters described it as fake news.
But they're coming at us thick and fast, with the leader of the free world and others in his regime saying things like this.
$50 million being sent to Gaza to buy condoms for Hamas. They've used them as a method of making bombs. How about that? They include hearing, vision, missing extremities, partial paralysis, complete paralysis, epilepsy, severe intellectual disability, psychiatric disability, and dwarfism all qualify for the position of a controller of airplanes. But we've suffered under the past administration for years and years. We've suffered with millions of criminals coming into our country. Criminals, people from jails from all over the world. They come through Mexico and they come through Canada too. A lot of them come through Canada, and a lot of fentanyl comes through Canada. And China makes the fentanyl. China makes the fentanyl, gives it to Mexico, puts it through Canada.
How do we sift through all this and work out what's right and wrong? What's freedom of expression and what's hate speech? Is this the start of a fresh wave of dis and misinformation?
We get a sense that there's a bit of a tidal wave of information coming to us that it's going to be harder for us to decipher.
And here's a warning. In the year that we go to the polls to vote for our mayors and councillors, this is what we can expect.
We're going to start to see more and more content that is either computer generated and harder for people to know its source, its authenticity.
More complaints made about the political information that's out there. I think there'll probably be a more polarised background to the elections and possibly more misinformation and certainly disinformation circulating.
Ursula Chair is a Canterbury University law professor specialising in media law. She says three things are going on that are feeding into the rise of mis- and disinformation. Number one, the growing power of the social media oligarchs.
Exactly, things like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk leading these incredible monopoly offshore businesses, wanting to have as much freedom as possible to publish whatever they want on those platforms. There's been moves, of course, for recently Mark Zuckerberg to disestablish his fact-checking team.
After Trump first got elected in 2016, the legacy media wrote non-stop about how misinformation was a threat to democracy. We tried in good faith to address those concerns without becoming the arbiters of truth. But the fact-checkers have just been too politically biased and have destroyed more trust than they've created, especially in the US.
Now, that's, of course, going to mean on these massive platforms that anything can be published, whereas in the past there may have been some attention paid to hate speech or racist material or other material that attacked diversity and those sorts of issues that are of concern to most democracies. And that must, of course, mean that is going to be less correct factual information proliferating on the platforms. We know, of course, in the past, these oligarchs have not hesitated to use their own platforms to, in fact, manipulate the information. There's plenty of evidence about the algorithms being altered to restrict information that was not looked on with favour by these oligarchs, and yet now there is an appeal to freedom of expression and a desire to have all information on these platforms, and the idea of the truth emerging out of a mixture of information. The second thing that is working against some sort of certainty around whether information that is available publicly is factually correct or not, is the continued decline of mainstream media. And in the circumstances I've described, mainstream media are the only bollock we've got to do the fact-checking for us. I mean, obviously, private industry and so on can do it, perhaps NGOs, but mainstream media, I think, are the last bastion.
Here's the problem with that.
The authors of a new report showing a major loss of trust in the New Zealand news media say it's time for news organisations to look in the mirror.
Just a third of Kiwis now say they trust the news. That's down 20% from 5 years ago.
The third factor is the rise of AI and the mistakes or bugs or glitches that the likes of ChatGPT make. Their creators call them hallucinations, as this Cambridge University expert explains.
Hallucinations involve factual errors and are usually fairly recognisable, like giving London instead of Paris as the capital of France. But as we come to depend more and more on AI for decision-making, we'll face murkier challenges once we move into areas like politics and ethics, where the right answers aren't so obvious.
So those three things to me are the main things I've observed that have happened since I spoke last on the programme, and I think they definitely indicate there's be a significant and ongoing increase in the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation.
How well do you think New Zealand is managing this?
The initial answer to that is that we're not managing it, but there are attempts going on, and the government is concerned about it, and some work is going on that could be relevant. We've got the ordinary regulatory responses that are still there. For example, under the Broadcasting Act that relates to the BSA, we've still got a code book that contains a requirement for balanced and accurate reporting. And we've got the New Zealand Media Council that's still got a principle that deals with accuracy, fairness and balance. Now, both of those regimes, of course, depend on complaints being made after something has been published. That relates really to mainstream media. So we've got this mosaic of regulation that it's beginning to be realised as probably out of date and not fit for purpose. Some work is being done in government on this. The Broadcasting Act is being looked at, for example, and there are some moves to look at the issue of whether we need one overall body, regulatory body, that could cover not only these forms of mainstream media, but also online media as well. We've got existing torts like the torts of defamation and privacy and so on that are there that could cover misinformation and disinformation.
They're not the only things, but it's very piecemeal and very slow. For example, the Law Commission is working on whether our hate crime laws should be changed, but a final report on that is not due until mid-next year. We're still waiting for the refreshed school curriculum and whether that will include more digital literacy. And when it comes to tackling the tech giants for compensation to our news media for use of their stories, our government has stalled a bill and is now watching how Australia does it.
They could well be doing that for looking at the other forms of regulation as well, because Australia is quite gung-ho about reform, and they do get stuck in and attempt to pass legislation and try and regulate quite quickly. In summary, there are things that are happening. They're not happening very quickly, and they appear to be, for New Zealand, quite tentative, and there does appear in this administration to be a desire to let the market sort things out as another alternative as well. And I think in terms of harms that might arise from mis and disinformation, I'm quite amazed by that.
But here's how complicated it all is. The online safety group NetSafe's been getting 25% more complaints every year. CEO Brent Carey says it deals with malinformation.
Malinformation is where information is used against individuals to harm them. And we do have laws here in New Zealand, the Harmful Digital Communications Act, which protects people against malinformation. So that's false allegations, breach of confidence, that type of information that's used against an individual. And people can make a complaint to NetSafe and we can look into how we might resolve that. But we're seeing an increasing amount of information used online against people, and that they can make a complaint about that.
So you're seeing an increase in complaints, and a big increase. I mean, 25% a year is significant. Does that match with what you're seeing online, or do you think there's a greater awareness amongst people that they can go somewhere to complain?
I think it's a combination of both those things. I think it's general awareness that NetSafe is there to take complaints, and more people are getting online. People are often getting their news, their views, a lot from social media, and also the hours they're spending on there are increasing. So, on average, most people might spend 4 to 6 hours. And so, I think it's a combination of both those things.
And malinformation, people can make a complaint if they are somehow harmed by what somebody has written?
Yes, so harmful digital communication is a written communication, a digital communication. Typically it's someone who posts some information on a social media platform and they're an affected individual by that post.
So would this content be targeted at an individual or group, quite personal content?
Yes, yeah, and they need to have suffered some serious emotional distress as a result of that content.
So that's the only way you can deal with a complaint?
Yes, so we're an office of second resort. Often people will first try and resolve it by contacting the platform, and then they'll come to us to say, look, can you intervene? And then if people aren't satisfied with the outcome, they can then go to the district court. And the district court can order different things that NetSafe can't do.
Brent says work is going on in institutions and non-profit organisations and community groups, but funding is getting more and more difficult.
So, for example, we're seeing agencies like Toa no longer exist. We're seeing, access to philanthropy funding in a cost of living crisis is harder, and we're seeing a long list of other non-social science issues taking precedent. The types of research grants and that are directed more at the technical, and we don't see a lot of projects that get put forward in this space, unfortunately, get the funding, and we think that needs to change.
What's going on in education? Because you went on a tour of some countries and looked at how schools are tackling this through their curricula. Finland was one example, leading the way.
Yes, they have very developed media literacy right from an early age, and the curriculum there really helps young people think about critical thinking, think about problem solving, identifying different sources, the art of argument and debate and facts. That was very much obvious in the classroom that we were able to observe in the content. And so that Scandinavian approach then is very interesting as to whether or not that's going to build more social cohesion and critical thinking skills.
Do we have that here?
So here we've got the curriculum being refreshed currently, and so we've got the first modules out, and we're waiting for the technology curriculum, a first look at that. So we don't know yet where these types of skills are going to be developed in the current New Zealand curriculum.
When we were talking the other day, you said there's another group, you call them the seniors, but the over 40s. That group is a real worry. Why?
Well, and I'm putting myself in that category because I grew up in Opunake, and we had one computer for the whole school. So the way that we engaged with online content was quite different. And if you then have now grown up in an internet-enabled environment, are you equipped with some of the issues that we're facing around what is a scam, what is mis and disinformation online, and where's the continuing education for adults? And so, yes, I'm confident that we're trying to focus more on youth, but let's not let our parents, our millennials, our grandparents also not have access to this type of skill, which is, a modern way of reading information online.
Is it naive to think that we can kind of live in this online world, which is our lives now, isn't it? Live in it safely and happily without this disinformation kind of overwhelming us?
It happens offline as much as it happens online, the way that information in communities and gossip and content flows. So we're going to encounter it in our online spaces. So I think it is naive to think that we could rid the online world of it when we haven't been able to do it in the offline world. What we have to get better at is equipping people when they engage with that type of content. How can they call it out? What does it look like? Is it fact from fiction? Those types of behaviours and skills, I think that's what we have to try and get young people and older people thinking about more.
I think we've had this approach for a while now where we're just little old New Zealand at the bottom of the world and nobody really takes an interest in us, and all the stuff that we read about in the news is happening somewhere over there and doesn't really apply to us. I think that's naive.
Tom Barraclough is co-founder of the Brainbox Institute. It's a think tank focused on regulation and digital technologies.
Probably one of the big picture themes here is that we all need to have some increased level of insight into these things, and we all do need to sort of equip ourselves to navigate this really rapidly changing environment. The environment that I'm talking about there is what people are starting to call the information environment. And what they really mean by that is we're talking to each other all the time, we're communicating with each other all the time, and the way that we communicate over time has changed radically. So the most obvious example of that is social media. But if you think about even before that, email, probably the newest one is podcasts, right? There's so much information going out through podcasts and these really long form formats that just aren't necessarily edited or fact checked in the exact same way that we would have expected from a radio broadcast, for example. So the information environment is changing. Part of that is a feature of the way that technology is changing. And what we really need is a kind of baseline to assess how it's changing.
What do you mean by that?
One is that we need a kind of ongoing measurement approach, like a public science of the information environment. So, for example, some researchers in New Zealand are primarily focused on Facebook posts by politicians that they fact check, whereas others are more focused on these kind of subterranean private messaging groups on Telegram, for example, where people are more or less congregating in order to discuss the kinds of topics that we might find alarming. So there's a question of where you look as well as how you are measuring what's going on in those spaces.
He says there's another approach being developed that says we should be looking at the big picture rather than just fact-checking and media literacy. We should be building up a better understanding of all the other ways the media environment works and what we're missing when it comes to getting information. Should we be measuring the sort of literacy, for example, that enables people to make better decisions about the kind of media they're consuming and how they identify harmful or wrong information?
And what we really need is a kind of an approach that indicates that we're ready to detect those things. Because if you think about it, if we're sort of broadcasting to the world that we don't think this is an issue, it's basically a big invitation to just come and try out your tools on us. So even if we don't actually find anything, or even if we don't find that there's an issue or some kind of influence campaign, two things. One, it's useful to know that. It's useful to be able to say, this is not a problem, and I know because I looked. And there's also a really powerful deterrent effect as well to being able to say, if you come and try this, we do have mechanisms in place for seeing what's going on.
If you're, advocating for a big picture approach, whose job is that? I feel like there's different groups doing different things, but there's not a complete oversight of things.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. So throughout 2024, Brainbox and the team at Brainbox were providing some support to the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet because they were leading some work on resilience to disinformation as a kind of whole of society type thing. One of the parts of that was a multi-stakeholder group. There were people from different backgrounds and different expertise who kind of came together to think about how we were going to deal with this issue. And actually the hardest thing was, whose job is it to act on this?
Is it the government's?
It can be really easy to just say it's the government's, and the government does have a really big role. So, for example, the government has access to insights and information and resources that we can't hope to ever achieve. It has, the national security apparatus, which is probably, as far as I know, the best sort of ongoing monitoring mechanism that we have. But again, we don't know anything about that.
So there could potentially be something going on within that government unit, but we just don't know. Is that what you're saying?
We just don't know, and it's hard to talk about it, right? Because it is an intelligence thing. And again, just emphasising, this is not me sort of signalling anything. I have no knowledge, and I'm quite certain as well, sort of going back to your question about whether it's the government's role, that government really doesn't want a part of this. So if you talk to kind of public servants, to them, the notion that they're going to be proactively monitoring the information environment to detect things that are arguably false or arguably hate speech is a nightmare. So imagine asking the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet to be fact-checking politicians during an election period. That's not something we really want the public service to be doing. It would be a massive trust building exercise required in order to do that. And then imagine the trust that would be broken if it was sort of done poorly. So it's really hard for government to act. That has sort of led us to say there is this kind of whole of society approach, and we do sort of need a blend of academia, community groups, industry participants, and probably government and particularly maybe independent Crown entities to be thinking about how we set up this kind of monitoring approach. It's a tricky design thing because as soon as you say this is our coordinated strategy and government's a part of it, you very quickly get back into this kind of program where you're asking government to kind of surveil public communications of the population in the name of keeping people safe and kind of fact-checking ideas. And that's uncomfortable from a human rights perspective and from a public trust perspective.
So where does that leave us, really? I mean, are we facing more of the same?
This is a common issue being faced by governments and non-governmental actors around the world. And what it is turning into is a kind of international program of work around information integrity as the concept. And what that means is there's a recognition that we need to have a range of different groups acting together, but also very much independently and transparently to build up this picture of the information environment and to try and understand it on a research-based factual basis. So there's a number of different programs being set up to try and foster this kind of international collaboration. And one thing that I feel quite strongly is that New Zealand needs to have a coordinated, coherent, proactive approach to engaging in these initiatives, because otherwise we're just going to be sort of swept up with whatever else is going on.
Now, if you're feeling completely overwhelmed and powerless, there is a glimmer of hope.
There's been a lot of photos circulating of all of the tech CEOs at Trump's inauguration, for example. And to me, I think what that is doing is making people aware of the fact that these big communication platforms and architectures do include within them decisions about what you can and can't say and what you can do using those tools. Some people are nervous about that, and I think that's fair, but one of the good things about it is that it's bringing some of these design decisions to the public awareness. So people are asking themselves, do I really agree with the way that, for example, Instagram is going to be moderating things that people say about particular groups? One hopefully positive benefit that we see from that will be people becoming more engaged with an understanding of digital systems and digital literacy. And I think one thing that would be fantastic to see is people becoming more empowered to use different platforms and different technologies and to impose different rules that suit them and their communities. So one thing I'll be watching for a lot is people shifting to these new platforms and really starting to take ownership over them. We've seen it so far with Blue Sky, but I think there are some other ones out there too.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and NZ On Air. Thanks to Brent Carey, Tom Barraclough and Ursula Chair. This episode was engineered by Jeremy Veal and produced by Alexia Russell. I'm Sharon Brett Kelly. Ka kite.